theoretical explanation of the Phillips curve, or the lack thereof, as we saw in the last part of this video lecture. So we're going to take a post-Keynesian approach as we have been doing in the rest of this course. In particular, we're going to be looking at Kaleckian pricing theory, which is a markup pricing theory, and I'll explain what that means now in a second. Let's start with the simple observation that the revenue of a firm can be expressed as the sum of the wages it pays out, the material, the cost of materials, and the gross profit residue, right? So here we have P is the price, Y is the output sold, and then we have the wage bill, materials bill, and gross profits. And let's break that down a little further. The wage bill, well, that's the wage rate times the number of workers, or the number of, more specifically, hours of labor you've employed. Then we have the price of the input materials times the quantity of input materials used, and then we still have that, the level of profits. Okay, now we're going to take this accounting identity and impose one behavioral assumption, which is the profits here, the gross profits residue, is going to be determined or covered, if you like, by a markup on these unit variable costs. Oh, no, I shouldn't say that. On, well, the labor and material costs. Let's get into a bit more detail on what I mean by that. So, essentially, you could, if you like, we're dividing this top equation here throughout by y, just to have an expression for p, and we're then supposing that profits are covered by a markup on the unit labor costs, which is simply, well, the amount you pay labor per unit of output, yeah, plus the amount you have to pay for materials, so the per unit of output. So this is the unit labor cost plus the unit material costs, and so we assume a la Kalecki that prices are simply a markup on the unit variable costs consisting of unit labor costs and unit material costs. How can we assume this? Under what premise? Well, if you've taken any economics course before, perhaps this may seem a bit foreign to you, especially if you've done conventional neoclassical pricing theory, where prices are determined or are equal to the cost of production, which is in some sense akin to saying, well, prices, there is no markup, if you like. There are, like, real gross profits are zero once you account for everything, because you have the assumption of a perfectly competitive industry. But in the Kaleckian world, and arguably in the real world, of course, firms are always making profits. In fact, that's their, their first order goal, if you like. So the assumption here in this markup pricing theory is that produced goods are made by oligopolistic firms, those with some market power, whereas the raw materials that are used as inputs are made by competitive firms. In that case, we can argue, well, prices are determined by a markup because they are not in a perfectly competitive industry. Okay, let's go into a little bit more detail on how we expect these unit variable costs to look like. Here on this graph, we have on the x-axis we have y, which is output. And on the y-axis we have prices and unit variable costs expressed in euros or in dollars. It doesn't really matter. Because we have a markup pricing theory, which, by the way, has been found to be backed, or has found to be in effect in a number of firms surveyed. So of course you can, when trying to work out how prices are determined, you can simply survey firms and see what they are doing. And well, markup pricing is one of the most popular ways of setting prices. Okay, so but what we see here is unit variable costs, according to Kalecki, are simply constant up until full employment production or full employment outputs. This is because, well, you have the labor, you have the machinery needed and you don't need to invest more or pay your workers more if you, ask your workers, for example, to work 25 or 30 hours instead of 20 hours, then you simply pay, the wage rates, and you can expect, that wage rate to be the same. Whereas after you get past full employment outputs, we'd expect these wages to go into, overtime wages, and so they start to rise, and perhaps, there's simply not enough capital, machinery, and so on to, accommodate all the workers trying to produce on those machines and so on. So we get these the limits of production, if you like. We get these diminishing returns to the inputs put in, and those inputs are getting more expensive. So that we see the unit variable cost curve start to bend upwards, but only after we get to full employment. Now, using this framework, we can differentiate or distinguish between cost push and demand pull inflation within the Kaleckian framework, at least. So cost push, well, if input prices rise, output prices will rise. Why? Well, because input prices will push up the unit variable costs, right? As we saw here, if this increases unit variable costs, increase, that line with the curve at the end just shifts upward, and therefore the prices, which are the markup on that unit variable cost curve, will simply go upwards too. So that, helps us explain the stagflation of the 1970s as oil prices went up, prices went up afterwards. There is room for demand pull inflation, at least in theory, so long as you get to a situation in which output demanded exceeds the potential output. So we're producing, consumers want goods to such an extent that the firm's capacity is overshot. So in that case, we would imagine, the price likewise curves upward this way, and so if there's such high demand above full employment outputs or potential outputs, and where potential output is determined by the firm's capital stock and the conventions around working hours and so on, then we know that prices will rise. So we have a demand pull inflation aspect as well. At the same time, within post-Keynesian theory, there is clear reason firms have clear reason to invest to ensure a sufficient degree of, slack. It's not normally the case that we expect firms to operate at full capacity 100% of the time. Why? Well, if you're at full capacity 100% of the time, it means that, if you have a slight increase in demand the next day, you simply cannot facilitate it or fulfill it, in time, right? You would have to go out and then suddenly invest in capital and perhaps find more workers to employ and so on. So that is, there's reason to leave some slack in the system, given that kind of fundamental uncertainty about what demand will look like tomorrow. So maybe the normal rate of capacity utilization is 90 or 80%, in fact, just so you have room to respond if needs be. Okay, so we've looked at the way unit variable costs can be affected and how demand can exceed potential outputs, but we haven't talked about how the markup may change as well and what can affect the markup. And this is particularly relevant for our explanation of the Phillips curve. So let's go through the points that Kalecki say influence and determine the markup. First, there's the degree of market concentration. This is pretty straightforward. This should, if you have more firms in the markets competing with one another, then we come closer to a competitive market, a more neoclassical world of price determination, where prices are equal to the marginal cost, and such that, with higher degree of market concentration, inflation should go down as firms compete more. Relatedly, there is the aspect of whether firms are competing on prices at all, or are they competing on brand awareness or quality or whatever other dimension you can think of. For example, luxury cars, aren't really, price competition isn't so relevant to luxury cars. Perhaps it's much more a matter of esteem and status and brand and so on. We have the clear relevance of overhead costs. So this is, the fixed costs that you pay regardless of how much you are producing, as opposed to unit variable costs, where for every additional unit of output you produce, there are additional costs. And overhead costs typically include, the rent of the factory in which you make your chocolate bars or whatever you're making, or the interest payments for that factory if you own it, or the managerial wages. If you think of the higher ups, the white collar workers, they're often, employed on a salary basis rather than on a per hour basis for the year and so on. So they don't really, their pay is not necessarily connected to the outputs that is produced. And we could think of certain taxes and so on, but I think the first three are the most important. And if those costs go up, a bit like unit variable costs, the markup must increase in order to, be able to then pay off these overhead fixed costs. So the markup is considered to cover those fixed costs that do not vary, right? So if they increase, then we expect the markup to increase and therefore prices to increase. Now, the last aspect, which is most important for our purposes, is the bargaining power of unions. What is the effect of an increase in the bargaining power of labor unions on inflation? Well, it's likely to cause an increase, though realistically it depends. For example, is the union operating at the level of the firm, the industry, or the economy at the national level? If it's operating at the level of the firm, then if a firm gives into the pressure of the union and pays its workers more, then it will have limited scope to be able to charge higher prices because they still have to compete with other firms, right, who maybe don't have unions pushing for higher wages. So in this case, if there's an increase in the bargaining power of the labor union in one particular firm, then we could say, well, inflation is unlikely to increase because that firm would simply become less competitive on the market to the consumer. So its markup would simply have to decrease without prices changing. But if it's at the economy level, for example, on the other end of the spectrum, then an increase in wages for everyone in the economy could simply just be passed on to workers in the role of consumer, because especially in a closed economy, there would be no fear of firms becoming less competitive if they were to charge higher prices to cover the new higher wages. So as wages go up, unit variable costs go up. Firms want to protect their markup, so they don't change this. They just increase prices, and because it's at the economy level, firms do not fear, the competition side of things. We're going to get into a bit more regarding labor unions using a simple model that's found in Mark Lavoie's textbook, Post-Keynesian Economics, New Foundations, from 2014, which summarizes a bit of the literature. So it's not completely from Lavoie, but it's summarizing what is out there in the literature. So now we're going to, in some sense, abstract away from material inputs, or we could equivalently, I guess, assume that the price of material inputs stays constant over time. But for now, let's just say that it's just labor is the only cost going in. So unit variable costs are equal to unit labor costs now, where we have this little y, where little y is equal to outputs over labor. So it's very much the same as before, except no material costs. Now, we know that the growth rate of prices, so inflation, is equal to, well, the growth rate of this, namely the markup, plus the growth rate of wages, minus, down here, labor productivity, as it's dividing here. Okay, so we get a very simple, very, very simple statement for the causes of inflation. So the inflation given this setup is caused by either increasing markups, so firms perhaps getting less competitive in a more oligopolistic market and so on, increased wages due to union pressure and so on, or decreased labor productivity, which doesn't really happen, right, given technological change. So yes, if we expect labor productivity to generally, as it increases, lower prices as firms are able to produce more given the same amount of inputs. Okay, this gives rise, or allows us to see at least, the notion of conflict inflation, which is very important to post-Keynesian economics. Rawthorne put it quite well when he said the working class can shift this distribution in its favor by fighting more vigorously for higher wages, although the cost of such militancy is a faster rate of inflation, as capitalists try, with only partial success, to protect themselves by raising prices. So this is the scenario where wages increase and prices increase at the same rate, such that the real wages of workers at the end of the day may not change much, if at all, depending on the pass-through of the higher wages into higher prices. So capitalists or employers' associations and workers or labor unions implicitly target a share of national income. This is going to be our assumption going into this model. And the essence of the model is that when the claims of these two sides, of the capitalists and the workers, conflict, then a wage price spiral of inflation follows. So we can see this quite easily as follows. Here we're going to put the growth rate of wages as some function between the real wage targeted by workers and the actual outcome in the last period. And here, this coefficient, omega 1, represents the bargaining power of labor unions, if you like, or the ability to change wages given this, what we'll call, aspiration gap. Yeah, the difference between what is happening and what workers target. Lastly, we can also index for changes in prices. So omega 2, the coefficient here, just says, well, how much labor unions effectively manage to convert an increase in prices into an increase in their wages. There's a sort of symmetrical aspect to the model here, where, on the other hand, firms are targeting profits. If they're targeting profit, it also means they are targeting a related price and wage rate. So in some sense, a real wage is only implicitly targeted by firms, but targeted nonetheless. And so we have an aspiration gap on the firm side as well. This is a phi 1. It represents the ability of firms to achieve their real wage. And again, we have some notion of indexation. It's just all very symmetrical here. So it's a very simple model where the rate of price increases, so the rate of change of prices is equal to the rate of change of wages. We can solve our model, and we find this sort of equilibrium, a long-run equilibrium, which is best described graphically, as a lot of things in economics. Here we have a sort of special case where firms have absolute bargaining power over the real wage rate. So in this case, we have phi 2, which tends to 1. So going back to our equation of the inflation rates, it just means that all changes in the wage rates are perfectly indexed to changes in prices. Alternatively, we could represent absolute bargaining power of firms by a coefficient here, which is infinitely large. In either case, it gives rise to this vertical price-setting curve from the firms and a otherwise usual downward wage-setting curve from the labor side. And when firms have absolute bargaining power, it doesn't really matter what where this wage-setting curve moves. That is ultimately up to the firms, how much they pay in wages, and therefore how they set their prices. Likewise, we could have a situation where firms have absolute bargaining power. Labor unions have absolute bargaining power. But these, again, is a special case. It represents the situation where all changes in prices are perfectly indexed by labor unions, or they have infinite bargaining power. But of course, the more general case is where there is no infinite bargaining power or perfect indexation, and in fact, there's a bit of no one is in an ideal or almighty powerful situation. Firms and workers must both negotiate, and if the claims are not mutually satisfied, then we can get we can have a difference between the goals, which leads to an increase in wages, which leads to an increase in prices, and so on. And there's only one particular target which satisfies both sides, as depicted here. Okay, so the post-Keynesian explanation of the Phillips curve is simply that, well, the higher the employment rates, the more bargaining power labor has. Firms cannot afford to lose its workforce. Sorry, let me explain why I say that the higher the employment rates, the more bargaining power labor has. Well, firstly, firms cannot afford to lose its workforce if the employment rate is really high. So imagine if you have an employment rate of 100%, or very close to it. If a firm loses one of its workers, it's going to be very hard to replace that worker, right? Laborers at the same time know they are likely to get a job elsewhere if the job is lost, right? So that's why we assume with higher employments there is more bargaining power on the side of labor. And unions are larger and more powerful with more people employed. Yeah? Thus, higher employment coincides with higher inflation. Typically, though, when unions have power, right? When labor is coordinated and organized, and we can see this graphically, where when there's a higher employment rate, this increase in bargaining power actually shifts the curve upwards. Yeah, so there's more indexation power, whatever. This shifts the curve upwards, and we have a new intersection between these two wage and price setting curves that gives rise here to a higher rate of wage and price inflation at the stable in the stable equilibrium compared to our initial equilibrium, giving rise to a higher real wage because, of course, laborers still have increased bargaining power due to increased employment, but at a stable higher rate of inflation. Okay, so that's why we imagine, with an increase in employment, so going this way, because of course here we have unemployment, we have an increase in inflation. Why? Because the bargaining power of labor has increased. However, so this is in some sense the post-Keynesian explanation of why the Phillips curve may exist, why we may see this relationship. But notice, out of these 3 points, one of them was very much conditional on the convention that unions exist and push for higher wages for its members. But unions have, of course, become much less powerful around the world in recent decades. And those that exist, or continue to exist, don't necessarily push for higher wages all the time, especially in Germany, in fact. Some labor unions here explicitly temper their wage demands in order to ensure that unemployment stays within a range that they would like. Why? Because Germany is an export-led economy. It doesn't want to push its wages. The unions don't want to push its wage demands too high in case they fear they will lose out in terms of exports abroad. So unions have become less powerful over time, and perhaps the whole labor market's completely changed such that, well, this explanation for the existence of the Phillips curve may also give us a reason why that Phillips curve no longer exists or no longer is so clear in the data, because over that period in which the Phillips curve has become harder to find, unions have also become, scarcer and less powerful, or their objectives have changed. Okay, there's been a lot to take in, so there's just 2 more slides to go, which are our policy recommendation slides, or at least a sort of summing up of everything we have seen here. First and foremost, let us conclude by saying, well, that link between inflation and unemployment that critics of increased government spending or big government put forward, that, well, increased government spending is going to cause inflation, that link that backs that claim is extremely weak and uncertain. In some countries more than others, but generally it's become weaker over time for most countries in particular. However, even if we were to accept that there is such a Phillips curve, well, we are currently living in a time of really low inflation and disinflation, a falling inflation rates, um, where in fact central banks are much more concerned about the threat of deflation than excess inflation. And as we can see for recent years, for many world economies, for the world average as well, we're around a rate of 2%, in fact lower than 0.5% in Japan in the last year. A bit of inflation would actually be contributing towards the goal of the central banks, of a stable rate of around 2%. So that even if there is a Phillips curve in action, government's induced inflation, if it were to occur, would actually be perhaps desirable. The last thing to address is, well, as we've seen throughout this course, addressing inequality probably requires, or yes, it should require strengthening the role of labor unions. However, we've also seen that stronger unions may also lead to runaway inflation if their bargaining power is put solely for the use of increasing the wages for the members of that union or the associated workers. So what could we suggest as a solution? Because we once increased union power without inflation. Well, there's been a number of works that Professor Hein, along with fellow economists like Engelbert Stockhammer and others, who have suggested a coordinated incomes and wage policy such that unions do not push constantly for higher wages. They establish a region of employments for which they would have the same real wage. So we have a stable real wage between a variety of nairus, if you like. And so it's to sort of steer the labor union policy while at the same time ensuring a high degree of wage bargaining coordination at the national level, so that before any wage price spiral can occur, there is the negotiation and coordination not only of labor unions and employer organization or associations, but also of the government itself in facilitating these negotiation and talks, so as to limit the chance that particular industries develop these wage price spirals and others do not. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. There's a lot to chew in this lecture in particular. I think you'll find the reading this week quite interesting. I'm sure I know I did. As it's a very recent report on not just the Phillips curve, but the potential end of inflation as it's kind of hypothesized. And we're going to be discussing what could be driving that. Okay, that's it for now. I will see you I'll see you on Thursday.